Please begin the recording.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right, are we good to go? Okay, hi everyone, my name is Olga Pizanova and I'm a lecturer at the department. We're very happy today to welcome Professor Odd Arne Westad, Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs, the Department of International Relations and International Laboratory on World Order Studies, and the new Regionalism of the National Research University High School of Economics, is holding our 12th session of Eurasian online seminar. As I've said, our speaker today is a world-renowned historian and foreign policy expert, Professor Odd Arne Westad, and the topic of his talk is the sources of Chinese conduct. Now, there's going to be an introduction to Professor Westad. Professor Westad specializes in the Cold War and contemporary East Asian history. He is the Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale University, where he teaches at the Yale History Department and Jackson Institute of Global Affairs. Previously, he held the S.D. Lee Chair of U.S.-Asia Relations at Harvard University, teaching at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Arne has also taught at London School of Economics, where he served as director of a foreign policy think tank, LSE IDEAS. In the spring semester 2019, he was Boeing Company Chair in International Relations at Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University. He's also a fellow of the British Academy. Originally from Ålesund on the Norwegian coast, he studied history, philosophy, and modern languages in Oslo before doing a graduate degree in US international history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Professor Westad has published almost 17 books, as we discussed, and a great many more articles, which we're not going to list here, most of which deal with 20th century Asian and global history. His three key works include The Global Cold War, which argues for ways of understanding the Soviet-American conflict in the light of late and post-colonial change in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. The second one is Restless Empire, China and the World since 1750, which discusses broad trends in China's international history since 1750. And the third one is The Cold War, A World History, which is my favorite book, which summarizes the origins, conduct, and results of the conflict on a global scale. There's also a new book, which is coming out in 2021. It's called Empire and Righteous Nation, 600 Years of China-Korean Relations. So we have something to look forward to as well. Professor Westad published an article called The Sources of Chinese Conduct, Are Washington and Beijing Fighting a New Cold War, in September-October 2019 issue of Foreign Affairs. The title is an obvious allusion to George Kennan's article, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, based on his famous long telegram, which was published in the same journal in 1947. Kennan's thoughts had a great impact on the US policy during the Cold War, although Professor Westad seems to argue that Kennan was not understood well enough. Okay, so I think I'm going to be done with the introduction now. And if you just to make sure once again, please use your real names or you will be removed from the conference. These are just security measures. If you'd like to ask a question, please indicate your desire to do so along with your affiliation in the chat window. And I'm going to call you afterwards. The talk will be slightly shorter than usual. It's going to be 15 to 20 minutes, and then we are going to have the Q&A session, which is great. We're going to have more time for the questions and answers. Now, Professor Westad, are we looking into a new Cold War?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for setting this up. Thank you, Olga, for sharing it, to Alexander, especially for inviting me, setting it up, Sergey, other friends in Moscow. I was just joking before we started that it's really wonderful to see how many of the connections, how many of the nodes in terms of discussing international affairs and global history that go through Russia these days. So Russians seem to be particularly good at setting up online discussion fora of all kinds. So this is not the first time I've been speaking to a predominantly Russian audience during this crisis. And may this long continue. So I hope this will be the first of many occasions where I will have a possibility for participating in these kinds of discussions with Russian friends. So I'm going to be relatively brief to begin with, as Olga said, in order to leave more time for discussion. I mean, this is in part because many of you have had a chance to look at this piece that came out in Foreign Affairs last autumn. I've also, by the way, I hope everyone is able to pick that up from the chat. I'm never quite sure how these things work, but I just tried to distribute via chat. Alexandra and Olga, maybe you could check if it's actually there. A new piece that I wrote on the effects that the corona crisis may have on global international affairs, which is going to be published in a newish journal called Global Policy that comes out of the Hertie School in Berlin.
That works fine.
It's probably also gonna. Is it up?
Yeah, that works fine.
Okay.
Open.
So if you had time to look at that, I mean, you could look at it while we're speaking, or you could look at it afterwards. It's sort of a kind of update in a way of some of my views. For those who know my positions from earlier on, there is very little there that will come as a surprise to you, but you may still want to have a quick look at it. Okay, so with regard to the foreign affairs piece, I think it's particularly important, since it has such a pretentious title, to note that that title, of course, is not mine. This is what the good people at the Journal Foreign Affairs themselves decided on. Mine was something much more pedestrian. But they found out that it was a good idea to sort of make a reference, fairly blatant reference, to Kennan's great piece back in the late 1940s. And I can see why they did that, because I mean, I do talk a great deal about Kennan in the piece and how I think that some of Kennan's views have been misrepresented. Unfortunately, not least by Kennan himself, as he got older and as he got more into political position. And then, of course, as those of you who knew Kennan will know, his views changed again towards the end of the Cold War. So this is a brief summary of what this piece says and what I'm thinking about it. So the first one on the Cold War question, and you will see this bantered about everywhere now, the new Cold War between China and the United States. You know, whatever this is, it's not a Cold War. And the comparison obscures more than it clarifies. I've discussed this with many who are on this call before. It's not just an academic discussion, it's an important one, because if we think that history is sort of doomed to repeat itself, and there are some people, not least here in the United States, who believe that, we become prisoners of history, not consumers of historical parallels. There are more differences than similarities between the US-China conflict today and the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. I think this audience is well informed enough that I don't have to repeat them, but let me just outline two that I think are significant. So the ideological dimension, which governed much of the US-Soviet competition, is, if not entirely absent, at least much less relevant here. This is a conflict much more about interests, about influence, about commercial advantage, in ways that remind me, at least, much more of the world conflicts the way they developed in the late 19th century than anything even remotely connected to the Cold War. And the second one, perhaps even more important, I'm not absolutely convinced, or at least I remain to be convinced, that the world as a whole is moving towards more bipolarity of the kind that we found increasingly during the Cold War. So with both the ideological dimension and the bipolarity dimension lacking, there are a few things, as I point out in the article, again building on Kennan, that we can learn from how the Cold War was conducted. But in terms of defining this as a new Cold War, analytically, really doesn't make much sense. You could as well say, probably even more ominously in many ways, that it looks a lot more like the world before the First World War than it does the world of the immediate post-1945 era. Then secondly, what is my concern here? I mean, what was it that really drove me to set out this piece now? And some of that has been much misunderstood. Again, especially I think on the American side. It is true, as many people have been saying in the newspapers and in the online discussions about this, that the article is a warning and particularly a warning to the United States. But first and foremost, it's a warning about power shifts happening too rapidly. Because if there is one thing that we can draw from the historical parallels that a lot of people, including my former colleague at Harvard, Graham Allison, has been working on, it is that if dramatic power shifts happen very, very quickly, and Graham has gone through this, lots of others have gone through it as well. I think it is undoubtedly true. A rapid power shift between the United States and China, or indeed between the United States and the rest of the world, for that matter, is not in anyone's interest. The hegemon disappearing fast is a recipe for instability, not a recipe for more happy shifts of power, whatever power challenges might believe. Now, one important reason why this power shift seems to be happening as quickly as I lay out in the article is, of course, connected to US domestic affairs. The fact, to put it bluntly, that the United States now has an administration that seems both incapable of handling a domestic dimension crisis, or in my view, represent the United States well internationally, whether in cooperation or in conflict, is one of the reasons why power seems to be dissipating, why things seems to be changing as quickly as they do. But of course, there is more to the international picture than just what happens domestically in the United States. It's also about Europe's difficulties, especially the economic difficulties, which have been highlighted, I think, in the current COVID crisis. The challenges that are there to the European integration project, the difficulties that I foresee in the future for Europe in terms of its development, primarily on the economic side. So there are other things changing as well as what is changing in the United States and in the US-China relationship. And then, of course, there is what happens with regard to China itself. And there is no doubt, as I lay out in this piece, that China has become more assertive towards its neighbors and more authoritarian in terms of its domestic governance over the last, now, almost decade or so. And that's a trend that seems to continue. Now, there is a big discussion, I hope we have a chance to discuss that later, whether that turn in Chinese attitudes, mainly under Xi Jinping, although some of these trends started before he became the head of the party. Whether this is in reaction to changing external circumstances, which I know a lot of people in Russia and in China are emphasizing, that there was sort of more of a challenge, particularly for what Chinese party leaders would call domestic subversion, directed by the United States, or whether it is in response to developments within China itself, not least within the Chinese Communist Party itself. In my view, and I don't go much into that in the article because there is always a limit in terms of how much you can put in, particularly to a foreign affairs piece. My own view is that it's a bit of both. Though I must confess that I don't think China's policy towards its neighbors, the more aggressive aspects of this, has served Chinese foreign policy well. It has more alerted everyone else, particularly along its rim or in India, to some of the challenges that will be there as China's power grows and as the United States becomes increasingly absent in terms of its presence, both economically and politically and strategically within the larger Eastern Asian region. Let me finish with maybe some reflections on Russia, so you will have something to go on in seeing my views on this. So Russia's policy with regard to all of this, and particularly with regard to China's very rapid rise, in many ways to me talked about this with many of you before, has made sense over the past 20 years, trying to develop a close relationship with China, tried to see this as a way of demming up American power on a global scale. I think we may be or getting close to a dividing line, a watershed there as well. So whether the degree of closeness, the increasing degree of closeness between China and Russia will also make sense over the next 20 years remains to be seen from a Russian perspective. I think there are many very positive aspects that I have lauded and highlighted in the cooperation between Russia and China that actually serves both countries well, and probably also serves the world well in many ways. So I'd much rather see a Russia and China that are able to cooperate well together than the kind of situation that existed between the two, or between China and then the Soviet Union during the end of the Cold War. But there is a part of me which also tells me that Russia is getting pretty close to running the risk of making the same mistake China made back in the 1980s. In other words, that it is supporting the rising superpower against the declining one, which produced, for a brief period of time, a unipolar world led by the United States that was not in China's best interest. We might not quite be there yet, but if the power shift is speeding up as a result of this crisis, which I argue in the piece that I just sent over to you, we might be getting there soon. I mean, to a position where it would be in Russia's own best interest to try to find a more balanced approach with regard to the various other powers that exist on the global scale. Now, someone I'm sure are gonna say, Russia would have done that a long time ago if it had been possible. I always find that that's sort of the foreign policy thinking point zero. Entirely saying that something is impossible to do because it hasn't happened yet, or because you don't think others would have an interest in it, is not the most advantageous or advanced form of foreign policy thinking. My argument is rather, somewhat realist manner, on the side of what would be in Russia's best interest, which I think over time would be such a more balanced approach. And I think, Olga and Alexander, that's all that I have to say to begin with. And then I think we should move to a discussion of this.
All right, thank you so much, Arne, for your wonderful insight. Could we just ask Professor Karaganov what he has to say about this? I believe Alexandra has to unmute him.
Sergey Alexandrovich, please, I will turn your microphone on.
Yeah, now it's fine. Well, first of all, I mean, the article was absolutely gorgeous, and the analysis was almost impeccable with all the uncertainties, and as well as your speech. The problem was, of course, the title, which was, as you told, was imposed, because you were short on recommendations, but you are not to be the person to recommend American foreign policy. But the article, I really enjoyed it, and as well as the conversation. The big question which I have is, of course, we could argue, I mean, as you did extremely well in some of other books or publications, whether it's Cold War II or something, but it does not matter. Yeah, it is a systemic confrontation for a while. I agree with you that Russia and that Russia will have to take a more balanced position if and when there is a possibility. But of course, leaning toward China, because we are closer to China, we have a huge border, we have more interest, etc. But the question is, which I have in my mind always when I'm thinking about these matters long term, and that is who is going to win. In the previous Cold War, Soviet Union was at great disadvantage. it was, first of all, it was facing the West. It had an ineffective economic system, by definition, and it was facing China since the 60s. So it was now China is in almost an opposite position. It doesn't have natural enemies. It faces only the United States. It is unlikely that the United States will organize the world against China with all the tries. And Russia is more or less on the side of China, though, as I've said, it will be looking for an independent position. And that is, I think, is unquestionable. I mean, Russia could not be in the somebody's sphere of influence. But then, if we take all that in consideration, that means that the United States are bound to lose under these circumstances, medium, long term, or else they will have to change their policies of containment. What is your thinking about that?
Very much similar to yours, Sergei. I think if we do compare this to the Cold War in sort of power terms, I think China does have many advantages over the position of the Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviet Union had some advantages too. I mean, at least for a while. So having an ideology that held out the hope for a better, a fairer, a more just world had a tremendous appeal, as we know, in many parts of the world. Could be seen as a Soviet advantage, at least for a while, until, as you correctly pointed out, some of the economic models that were developed inside the Soviet Union itself did not deliver, did not produce the kind of growth that the peoples of the Soviet Union themselves saw as necessary. I think the drawback for China, I mean, the challenge for China in the immediate future, and now I'm thinking sort of 10, 15 years down the road, will mainly be the Eastern Asian region and what will happen there. It won't be Russia. I don't think it will be, even in a bilateral sense, the United States. It will be how to create a region around itself that is more cooperative and therefore more geared towards China's interest than what is the case at the moment. And as you know, there are different trains of thought with regard to this, including inside China itself, particularly about how to achieve it. So there are some people who are arguing very forcefully that China needs to be stronger, more hardline in terms of its representation of its own interest towards the rest of the region. Because if not, the natural instinct of many of these countries in Southeast Asia, for instance, or Japan, will be to cooperate more closely with the United States in order to balance Chinese power. Now, at the moment, and this is almost reflective of Russia's situation, as we talked about before, under the Trump administration, they don't have much of a chance of doing that. And it's striking, at least to me, how quickly the deterioration in terms of the view of the ability of the United States to effectively support friends and allies in East Asia has been going downhill within these countries themselves, including in Japan. That's one of the most destabilizing aspects of the situation. So there are other people then in China who are saying, a little bit reflecting on what you have said, time is on China's side. Why rush it? Build over time, go more back to the Deng Xiaoping strategy in terms of regional affairs, to build close friendships and alliances, and try to put aside issues that have to do with conflict, such as in the South China Sea. Up to now, they have been in a minority, I think it's correct to say, within the leadership. But there are voices, as we know, who are arguing that. And I think that debate within China is going to be very significant for what the immediate future is going to look like.
Now, well, but I put two questions in my previous remarks. One question was not answered, and I said that if situation is different, and it is highly likely that China would not lose or will be winning, could we expect that the United States would change course? Mm-hmm. And instead of containment, will go for some kind of rapprochement? Of course, not now, because we know the situation in the United States ideologically, but don't you expect that over, say, 5-7 years, there could be a change in the U.S. policies of China towards a more realist one and towards a more cooperative one? Mm. It is very important. The answer is very important, yeah. Too, as you might understand.
Sure. No, it's an important question, Sergey. Of course, that is possible. I mean, again, there might be some parallels here, both to British discussions prior to 1900 with regard to Germany, particularly in the 1890s, and of course, American discussions with regard to the Soviet Union in the 1970s during the détente era. The problem, I think, and I think all of us know this, is that the United States, in its incarnation as a global power, that is from the interwar years onwards, has, I think, in part because of its domestic ideological framework and political framework, shown itself to be almost uniquely badly suited for striking these kinds of compromises on a global scale, at least those that we lost and lost for a long period of time. It is very striking in this country now to see how all sides of American politics have turned towards a confrontation with China. Certainly not just within the Republican Party. I think if the election goes in a different direction this autumn, which is possible, I don't think some of the fundamentals in terms of US policy toward China will change. Now, your question, I know, Sergey, is more about the longer time period here. And that brings me back to my points about what happens in Eastern Asia. So, and these are, for what they were, the recommendations that I try to present to policymakers in both countries. What the United States and China needs at the moment, more than anything else, just like the United States and the Soviet Union did back in the 1960s, is something to cooperate about. It won't be everything, right? And rivalry won't go away. But something that can produce more relaxation of tension between the two sides. And the people on the Soviet side back in the 70s and on the US side too, Nixon, Kissinger, these kind of people, were smart enough to realize that at least a temporary relaxation of tension would be in both sides' interest. But they also realized that one couldn't build that out of nothing. So they had arms control. Some of us were pretty radical in our view of arms control, believe that arms control was invented, more or less, to fill that purpose, right? More than the actual negotiations going on. And there was a relaxation of tension with regard to Europe as well that was very significant. Is it possible for China and the United States to find something like this with regard to Eastern Asia? My number one candidate has always been the situation on the Korean Peninsula, which doesn't look very good at the moment. But that's one of the things where it would be possible to find a set of compromises, maybe even a set of compromises be forced to the fore by developments within the Korean Peninsula itself. This is one of the things that I write about in this new book that Olga mentioned at the beginning. We don't know, but that's obviously what is necessary. But the picture at the moment, both for historical reasons inside the United States, the rapidity of changes within China and regional relations do not look good for the kind of more uniform approach to a détente period that we would hope to see.
Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Perhaps now it's time to ask Professor Lukin what he thoughts.
I have kind of connected question. Well, what the United States, both parties are doing at the moment is that they're kind of, by being tough on both Russia and China, they're pushing them together. And this would have been seen as a very crazy policy to most American politicians before, like Kissinger, or even Brzezinski, or many other people. Because from the geopolitical point of view, it's nonsense. But if they thought about, as you propose, what Russia and China really wanted without loving them, but just for the purpose of playing on some possible disagreements or their own wishes, they could have prevented that to a certain level. But the problem is that the purpose of your article, or the main idea, as I understand it, well, I'm not discussing now the particular analysis of what China wants. I basically agree with most of it. But the general idea is to explain to Americans that they should understand what China wants. And this was also the idea of Kennan, of course, and even Kennan at that time, they did not understood very well. Well, they accepted only the tough part of his idea, the containment part. But Kennan actually also wrote that you should be fair to Russia, kind of, that you should not expect too much. I remember he wrote another article in the 1950s on that. Well, also explaining very, very clearly that, I mean, if Russia changes its regime, don't expect too much. Be happy about it and be modest. Don't expect it to be, like the United States, turning into a United States. Well, that would be good enough for you, very good. But they forgot all that part. And Kennan actually lived quite a long life, and he was still alive when to criticize the American policy after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But today, the situation is even worse, I think, because nobody even wants to do in the United States to think about anything, to think about other people, to think strategically or geopolitically. They're just quarreling with each other. So that's very strange. I mean, so the question is, what are the chances that the Americans, or what should happen that they understand that they should understand other countries again? Like they first began to do that, you probably remember, during the Second World War, when all this kind of cultural theories began. During the war, when they began to analyze Japan and all this other cultures, kind of. It was, I think, what was it? Some psychological theory or something at that time. It's called.
And anthropological.
National psychology, I think. Yes, but it was actually started by the military people who wanted to understand what to do with these countries, what they really want. So, do we need another war? For Americans to try this again? Or not?
Well, we're in the middle of a pandemic now. Now you're calling for a war.
No, but as usual, I agree very much with what Alexander is saying. I mean, so two things on this. I mean, on the first part of your comment, and then the second. So, again, a lot of people are on this call know it. So, what was picked up, at least at the sort of higher level? So, what was in this article that I wrote? It was that little paragraph that was on Russia. Right? That was the only thing that was picked up. For the rest of it, in spite of what I tried to say, there were the sort of usual reflections, right, coming out of Russia. But on that little paragraph on Russia, where I basically say, for those who haven't read it, that it's not in the United States' best interest to have a lasting negative relationship with Russia, in spite of disagreements, in spite of the worries about Russian policy and Russian behavior in parts of the world that many Americans do not agree with, not just those in power. But in spite of that, it is not in the United States' best interest to have a lasting conflict with Russia under the current circumstances, simply for the same reasons as Alexander said. Geopolitically, this makes no sense whatsoever. It's like a capitulation with regard to geopolitics to make sure that you have a lasting negative relationship with both of the two other powers that are more significant, at least in strategic terms, on a global scale. So why has that point in this article, and other people who've been saying the same, I'm not alone, many people who've studied US foreign policy for a very long time have been saying this. Why is that so difficult? Now, I think for two reasons, and this goes to the latter part of what you just said, Alexander. One is that there is now underway in this country, much as what we have seen on earlier occasions in the early part of the 20th century and in the middle part of the 20th century, a general direction where a lot of people who should have known better see the outside world as threatening and as the root cause of all of America's problems. Now, some of this is connected to trade, as we know. Some of it is connected to the overall strategic situation. Out of it comes the kind of mood that exists at the moment. But I think it's really important then to note that, this being the case now, it's probably going to continue to be the case for some time. And I do think that in a kind of skewed way, but only visible, I think, to those who really understand American history, that it's this kind of campaign against outside challenges that probably stands the best chance of actually bringing Americans together in a more sensible way to think about their own problems. I mean, that's what happened in the early part of the 20th century. That's what happened during the Cold War. And that's also likely to happen now, but it's going to take time. And that's the reason why in my oral remarks to you today, and in some of our earlier discussions, I've emphasized the role that Russia, for its own reasons, need to play in terms of achieving more of a balanced global situation. Because if the response to this kind of development with regard to American politics and foreign policy would be a closer relationship between Russia and China that would be seen as even more threatening on the American side. I don't think that's necessarily in Russia's own interest. So when I was saying this to another Russian audience, one of the younger participants said, isn't that asking too much of Russia? To behave sensibly in this kind of situation. That depends. I mean, it depends on what one sees as being, I think, in one's own best interest, as Sergei was saying earlier on, a little bit beyond, what happens next year or maybe even the following year, and to try to think strategically about this for a longer period of time.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much. I believe Vasily Kashin is going to be the next one to ask a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for your excellent lecture. I have a question concerning the strategy in this Sino-US conflict. It appears that if we consider China to be growing stronger year by year relative to the United States, even in military terms, like they're building twice as many surface ships as the Americans in tons, doesn't that mean that it's absolutely rational for the Americans to escalate as quickly as possible, just to push everything they have for one decisive strike, taking into account that the Chinese are not yet ready, they're not experienced for this kind of conflict, they have this huge heritage of 30 years of Taoguan Yanhui policy, and their military is not experienced. I have these feelings that sometimes the Americans just think that the Chinese are not ready, and one good decisive escalation, one good strike could break them, if not break them, put them into defensive for a very long time. And it seems that what Trump is doing from the American point of view is absolutely rational. Of course, there is clumsy implementation. He is making mistakes, spoiling relations with the allies, but he actually has, if they have any chances at all, they have them now. If that is not happening now, they're quite likely to lose. And well, I think from the Russian perspective, this outcome is not specifically threatening, because there is a belief that even if China wins, it will never be able to exercise global leadership the way the Americans do. They will not be able to install any kind of unilateral system like they use now to conduct economic warfare against us, etc. So in this case, no one is particularly maybe keen to support them in this decisive moment, like in major terms, but still their defeat would be absolutely undesirable for Russia. I mean, the Chinese defeat. The best scenario looks to be a prolonged conflict when all mid-power could benefit, like it happened during the previous Cold War. So doesn't it look to you that now it's a good time to escalate for the Americans, and they would just do it for several years in more and more forceful manner?
Well, this is, I think you're right, Vasily. This is one of the scenarios that frightens me. If you think about this, both from the American and from the Chinese perspective. And that's why I brought in, you know, the parallels with the late 19th century or even the very early 20th century. Because there is a form of thinking on both sides, both in Washington and in Beijing, that is about the timing of this conflict. You're absolutely right on that, and about the scale over time, right? And this is something that, you know, both in political science and in history, we haven't really done enough comparative research. I would encourage people to do that, to think in parallels with regard to this. The term which was popularized, at least after the fact, by the German General Staff prior to the summer of 1914, is the term maximum moment. So what is the best moment for trying to achieve what you want to achieve? And you can find similar terms being used both on the American and the Chinese side now. That frightens me. As Olga said in her introduction, I spent most of the spring and early summer of last year in Beijing, and was able to talk to a lot of people about these kinds of perspectives there. So in sum, I think my view is, if we talk about the American side first, I think there are a lot of people, though not many of them with a deep sense of strategy, who think that Trump is right in trying to push back on Chinese power. Now, I would probably be slightly more skeptical than what you are on how effective that pushback can be, at least as long as it's limited to the kinds of things that Trump seems to be interested in, which is mainly trade and economic issues. I don't think that a prolonged trade war with China would necessarily harm China more than it harms the United States or the world economy for that matter. And if this pressure is going to be taken further, so develop into a strategic pressure of the kind, or even a containment of the kind that we found against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, then of course the United States is intimately linked to working with its friends and allies within the region. And this is something that the Trump administration has been so far entirely incapable of doing. Now, that might change with the new administration coming in. That would put more of an emphasis on this, but not change the policy in terms of general aspects too much. But I'm also worried about the Chinese side, because there are a lot of people, sometimes people with a lot of sense, who have known for a long time, who are saying that we are now coming up to China's maximum moment. It's not given that China's relative power on a global scale will ever be better with regard to its region than what it is today. Right? Even in terms of employing means of deterrence against the United States fleet in the Western Pacific, or these significant parts of the Western Pacific, in a conflict, for instance, over Taiwan, conflict over the South China Sea, or even a limited conflict with Japan, let's see, that could have a positive effect in establishing this as a Chinese region, which China might not, both for regional and for bilateral US-Chinese reasons, with a new administration in place in Washington that would have turned around some of these policies, will not be in a better position to undertake, 5 years from now or 10 years from now. Now, I think this is a minority view in Beijing, and all of you who know how Chinese decision-making works know that there are many different voices, even under current circumstances with regard to this. I spent a lot of time, Alexander and I discussed this, I spent a lot of time speaking to Chinese military people when I was in Beijing this time. And it was really interesting to see, for the most part, how cautious they are with regard to this kind of thinking. There are exceptions, but among people who are really in positions of command and responsibility, they are certainly not among the hawks on these kinds of issues. They are among the hawks on a number of other issues that generally tend to be outside their immediate domain, and therefore, of course, they cannot speak openly about it. We know this from other sources. But in terms of the kind of thinking I just reflected, thank goodness, many of them are on the more cautious side. But some people among the politicians are not. And one thing that really frightens me is that among the younger people within the Chinese leadership, this kind of maximum moment thinking seems to be more prevalent than among the more senior ones.
Thank you.
Great. I hope vastly satisfied with such an extent.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Could you now ask to unmute the microphone for Sergey Trush? Sergey, could I just ask you to be a little bit brief, because we seem to be running out of time, even though we had plenty.
Okay.
Thank you.
To be brief, I'll just skip one question and just try to pose only one. You're finishing. Thank you for the article. It was very interesting. And you're finishing your article with quite a philosophically pessimistic outlook on the future world order. That is based on your premise that until United States will be not ready to, at least to a certain extent, regain its strategic, geopolitical, globalization type capacities to be more controlling this order. This order will not be existing in a quite organized type. My question pertains to the Chinese ambitions about globalization. Since Trump put his new strategy of withdrawing from globalized relations and withdrawing from the obligation of United States in globalized world, Chinese, as we know, were quite quick to respond on that. You remember all these statements that were done quite quickly after Trump's strategies were put on the table. And the understanding is that the China is ready and is trying to substitute United States in a structure of globalization. But there is understanding from a certain point of experts that China at this very moment has a lot of ambition to do that, but not very ready in many realms. Chinese political system is not open too much to be connected with the globalized world. Chinese economic system is too rigid and too state-oriented to be well connected with the global value chains or the separation of separation of labor. Chinese ideology is rather xenophobic at this very moment too, to be connected with the globalized world. Historically, China has a lot of historic traumas, and this is affecting its effective connection with the globalized world. So I would like you to, what is your perspective on this understanding? Probably you have another view of how China could be developing to be not a center of Pax Sinica, but probably the nucleus of the new type of world order. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Sergey. That's a good question. And you're right in saying that I end this piece on a relatively pessimistic note. I'm pessimistic in the sense that, you know, I see the waning of American power on a global scale with the rapidity with which it now happens as being not a good thing. That's not because I celebrate American power in the sort of broadest sense. I mean, I don't believe that the world needs one hegemon in order for the international system actually to work. I think it would be entirely naive and ahistorical to claim that, or if I may say, you have to be an American in order to claim that. That's not the point. The point is about the rapidity of change and how quickly things are happening at the moment. And as the latter part of your question implies, that it would be really difficult under the current circumstances. And here I also get back to Russia's role, to see a multipolar system put into place very quickly, which is what we are seeing now, which would be less oriented towards conflict and confrontation than what we have seen since the Cold War ended. So my argument is systemic, not specifically oriented towards one power or another. We have, after all, had a situation since the mid-1940s in which the United States has, up to quite recently, to an increasing degree, been the main pole in the international system. Not predominant on everything. The United States has never had that position, not even during the 1990s, but the predominant power. I think that will, within a generation from now, stop being the case. And I do not think that that necessarily is a bad thing. But I do think it would be hugely problematic if this happens very, very quickly, say within the span of even a decade, because it would be destabilizing in a very broad sense. That's my concern at the end of this piece. And that has to do with, as you said, China not for a lot of structural reasons being capable outside of its own region for certain, to be able to take on the kind of responsibility that the United States has had for a very long time, and which I think is necessary in order to deliver common global goods that would be in everyone's interest. I think Russia's policy over the past decade or so has also shown that Russia is increasingly preoccupied with its own near problems, not necessarily within Russia itself, but along its borders, maybe a little bit further away, but certainly do not want to take a systemic responsibility in a sort of broader sense. So, and likewise, regional hegemons in other parts of the world. So it would be a very unruly world. We might be able to manage that through multilateral forms of cooperation, a sort of lowest common denominator in terms of what can be carried out internationally. But I'm not even sure of that in the current situation. So what I foresee as the most positive result, and I'm sorry to be rather pessimistic in my comments on most things today, is a slower decline in American power and an ability for, relative to what, but all that broader retreat of American power over a long period of time. We know that that can work, right? Because we had historical epochs before we have seen this very, very clearly. Countries do, state systems do adjust themselves in these kinds of situations, but they find it incredibly hard to adjust quickly. When quick adjustment is called for, you get these cataclysmic situations that the 20th century had so many of. And that's my fear, that's my worry.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Nikolai Petro, please. You want to ask a question, I believe.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Greetings from the University of Rhode Island, which is right next to Connecticut.
Just off the road.
Just off the road, right. Well, Sergei Trushis, to some extent, and your answer to his question have preempted much of mine. I, too, was struck by your pessimistic assessment of a multipolar world. But let me move on then to a more practical question, because you've said 25 years would be better, 5 to 10 years not so good, and I understand the thinking and I understand the scale. So my practical question then becomes, how realistic is it to expect that an American elite, such as we know it to be historically, with its messianic impulses, which go back decades, if not centuries, how realistic is it to teach this American elite about decline, about gracefully accepting decline? Kennan failed, and he was bitterly disappointed by that, I think. But anyway, I'm just wondering about that aspect. Thank you.
That's one of the biggest questions of our time, Nikolai. I think, you know, all countries are put together differently in terms of the cultural and social aspects that create the political systems and the policies that come out of it. And not least the current crisis that we're going through now bring that to the fore, right? It shows some of the absolute weaknesses in the United States and in Britain for that matter, and some of the strengths in some Asian systems and some European systems. Now, these fundamentals in terms of foreign policy have a tendency not to change very quickly or to change rapidly over time. And I think that's also true for the United States. I mean, your question is really one that I've been asking myself all of my professional life. Is it possible for the United States to become a normal country? A country that sees itself as one power among other powers? I think the answer to that is a qualified yes, but it takes time. It will not happen quickly. And this is part of the reason for the warning that is in the foreign affairs piece, is simply about that. Because, you know, if this had just been about American messianic approaches to the rest of the world, our predicament would probably have been less than what it is at the moment. It's also about how aspects of that very same policy impulse is tearing at the roots of American society and American politics domestically at the moment, as you know, since you are based here, right? With this tremendous, the tremendous divisions that exist in terms of approaches to handling domestic problems. So I'm not much of an optimist on this in the short run. So therefore, even more of a reason to think about this over time. So is it possible to foresee a United States that is more oriented towards it? If you want to have a collective sort of summing up of this, towards its interests in seeing itself as a state interacting in normal ways with other states within the international system. Yes, we can get there over time, but it will not happen anytime soon. And when it happens, it will obviously be in a different way than what Russia, based on its historical traditions, or China, based on its historical traditions, will carry out. So I think the answer to your question is that these are the kinds of things that we should be looking at, and we have to look at them over a great period of time. Expecting that in the shorter run, like your question implied, Nikolai, is impossible. It will not happen. And that's the reality that we have.
All right. I believe we have Dmitry Suslov who now wants to ask something as well. Thank you.
Hi, Dmitry.
Hi.
Oops, he's muted.
Дмитрий Вячеславович, секундочку, я включу звук. Все.
Yeah, hello, Dr. Westad. It's very good to see you. The last time we met was in Moscow at the US-Russian working group talking about the new Cold War. I totally agree with you that it would be extremely difficult for the United States to become a normal power. But since we are talking about China, not the United States, my question is also about China and about the possibility whether it will be difficult for China to be a normal rising hegemon. You know, there is a very intensive discourse these days, both in the United States and in Russia, about the implications of the corona crisis on the Chinese foreign policy. And one of the arguments is that Chinese foreign policy has become more self-assertive, more assertive, more self-confident. And China has completely rejected the Deng Xiaoping's logic of hiding its strength and then is kind of imposing itself at the world arena. And many experts describe the US-Chinese conflict, which again, I agree, it is a systemic confrontation, whether we define it as a Cold War or not, but the conflict is described as a clash for leadership. But my problem with such an approach is that do we really see the indications of leadership or the will to impose leadership on the part of China? Does China has a leadership strategy? Does China behave now as a typical rising hegemon which tries to replace the existing hegemon with itself? And my understanding that so far it is not. Yes, we do see more assertiveness of the Chinese foreign policy, but I do not notice the elements of leadership or global leadership aspirations in China. Do you agree with that? Do you see or do you expect China to acquire the elements of global leadership in its foreign policy to try to position itself as someone who will run the world, you know, after the United States? If not, then I would completely agree with the explanation that Vasily Kashin gave before behind the Russian policy. Why should Russia not support China in this clash with the United States if China just, you know, because Russia wants a world which is not dominated by any great power. Neither the United States nor China. China doesn't want a Chinese-dominated world for sure, but Russia also doesn't want the US-dominated world at the same time. So if China replaces the United States, if China topples the United States out from the global pedestal, but doesn't take this place itself, it would be an ideal world, you know, for Russia. So what do you think about this? About the Chinese policy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dmitry. As always, that's a really good question. It's a big strategic question that you touched upon now a couple of times. You know, to try to think about this in a way at two levels. So what happens over the next decade and a half, and what happens over the next generation? I mean, those are the right categories to thinking, as I try to teach my students here. On this. I mean, just looking at what the situation is going to be in the next couple of years, in policy terms, of course, you have to do it. But if you try to understand it in a broader sense, you have to think much more long term. And I agree with you that I don't think China has the capabilities or indeed the interests at this point to replace the United States, at least quickly, as a hegemonic global power. I think, on the contrary, there's many good reasons why China is trying to avoid having to move into that kind of position prematurely. What China wants to do is to become the predominant power within its own region. There are some uncertainties about how far that region goes. It certainly includes Northeast and Southeast Asia. Does it also include South Asia? Does it include Russia? We don't know. That's perhaps the more longer term perspective that we're looking at. But you know, countries do not always get what they wish for in terms of international developments. And that's what the 20th century especially, like the 17th century for that matter, are good sort of global reminders of, right? That sometimes change does happen much more quickly than anyone can foresee. If we look at the most recent example, the collapse of the Soviet Union, you know, very few people who were able to foresee that as a consequence. The Chinese, and possibly the Americans as well, at least some Americans in the then George H.W. Bush administration wanted a much reduced Soviet Union, but not necessarily the Soviet Union to go away the way it happened, right? So that's the dilemma, I think, with regard to the Chinese position as well. I mean, it is possible under the current circumstances, what we're looking at right now, and that's the reason why I wrote this piece, that the waning of American power, the retreat of American power will be much more rapid than what we have been able to foresee. For some reasons that have to do with China, some that have to do with Russia, many that have to do with the United States domestically, right? And that leaves us in a very different kind of world. So then the big question becomes, and this is one that would be interesting for us to explore a bit further. You know, to begin with, one then would foresee that that would be a return to multipolarity, which I think most of us would see as an international system that not necessarily is negative, you know, in itself. I certainly belong among those. I think multipolar international systems are generally more stable. They're certainly more prevalent in history than what bipolar or unipolar systems are. So there's nothing much to regret in that. The problem, again, for me, Dimitri, is the speed with which it happens and the kind of conflicts, particularly around the edges, that can be set off by such a very dramatic change in how the international system operates. And I just don't think that the global multilateral institutions that exist at the moment would in any way be able to handle that kind of situation. So it would come back to the possibility for agreements among great powers. I'm sorry again to sound like an arch realist on this, which I'm not, but I do think that that's the direction that global policy would be moving in. And the chances for that happening now, I think you would agree with me, are relatively limited, right? The United States is not going to take its decline mildly or well, as Nikolai indicated. It's not going to be a benign decline in hegemony, to use your Schifrinson's phrase. China could very easily be moved by such rapid developments into dramatic overreach within what it considers its own region, which could lead to war. That worries me. Not directly against the United States, that's not on the cards, even in the case of Taiwan. But as you know, there are plenty of other issues that could lead to this kind of a situation. So the sense of the system going away, no one knowing what it's going to be replaced by, and all of this happening within a decade, or maybe a little bit more than a decade, that's what worries me. It's not multipolarity in itself. God bless multipolarity. It's a fine international system, if you can get there without things going seriously belly up.
Okay, right, thank you. So I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I'm going to use my privileged position here and ask a question myself. So I just wanted to point out that what I like your books for so much is that you place everything into a kind of narrative and show how everything is connected and how events relate to one another, how things have global significance, repercussions, and lead to one another. This is what I also try to discuss with my students at a great length. So I'd like to think these slightly global terms as well. And so if we think in global terms, historically, empires, they used to become normal powers after major wars, like Japan or the UK. They were able to accept the fact that there are other powers in the world as well besides them after these major wars. So does the US need another war to become a normal country? This kind of relates to Alexander's question, but not quite. And I mean, there was the Vietnam War, of course, but it was a relatively small embarrassment for the US in comparison. Or do we need another Cold War? Does the Cold War qualify as a world war? You know, Barry Buzan, we had him speak at the seminar earlier as well. He mentioned that the Cold War was the Third World War. I was wondering what you think on that as well. And another question would be that you write a lot about China and Japan. China and Korea, right? So there's a book on Korea coming out as well. So does that mean that by exclusion, you don't suppose Japan played that a significant role in the shift of balance of powers in Asia historically? Or is it too special and does it deserve a separate book? Thank you very much. So 2 questions there.
Thanks, Olga. On the latter, yes, it does need another book, and I intend to write it. So, you think so? American approach will be brought about, if ever, it's very difficult to foresee. One would hope that it would not depend on a war or a wartime kind of setback. I think my own view is that it's much more connected to economic affairs at the moment, and how the United States' competitive edge with regard to the rest of the world will develop over the next decade. I mean, on this is a point I often make to my American friends, time is really running out for the United States. It's not that its economy necessarily, at least before this current crisis, was doing that badly, relatively speaking, was doing badly compared to East and Southeast Asia, but then everyone is doing badly compared to East and Southeast Asia. It's more about its more basic functions for the future. I mean, the United States, if it's going to stay in its current position or even become a strong power within a multipolar system, will have to become more productive. It has to stop simply being an importer of capital. It has to stop having a social system that is so blatantly unjust that some of its abilities to create domestic progress are held back. That, I think, is the real challenge for the United States at the moment. It's a challenge not only for the United States, it's a challenge for a lot of countries that have seen decreasing mobility and extreme rise in inequality, which, you know, one may criticize for being unfair, but also has very, very negative economic consequences, right? So, you know, that's, I think, where one has to look. If the United States is more capable, and that will take political leadership way beyond what we have at the moment, to create a domestic economy that actually works better compared to the rest of the world, I don't think we'll need, you know, another war in order to concentrate the American mind. But something has to change. I mean, you're entirely right on that. On China and the rest of the region. So I think the reason why I wrote this little book now on China and Korea and try to understand that very peculiar relationship in a long historical perspective is that I'm seriously worried about what the outcome of the conflict on the Korean Peninsula is going to be. I have this very strong feeling that whatever we are looking at now, I may be wrong about this, and I know there are people here in the audience who know a great deal about Korea, but I have this feeling that from most perspectives, things are not moving in the right direction with regard to Korea, particularly with regard to what could happen within the time frame that I'm now looking at. I mean, not tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, with regard to North Korea. The best that we can hope for probably is a North Korea at the moment is a North Korean leadership that will stay in place, more or less the way it is now, in a gradual development. But I'm not sure we will get that. And in a period of very rapidly declining global hegemony, with a retreat of American power, with a rapid growth in China's power, with a Russia that is uncertain about where it wants to move internationally, a big crisis on the Korean Peninsula could be an absolute disaster, way beyond anything that we have seen since 1945. Because it's pretty clear to me that with any kind of change from the current situation there could unleash a major international conflict. And when I was in Beijing last year, it was also very interesting to see that that's the scenario that most Chinese strategic planners, at least those I'm able to talk to, seem to be most worried about. Worried to the point that this is the one where they are absolutely insistent that they would be able to handle it if it happened. And I've been in China long enough to know that when leading Chinese tell you with absolute confidence that they have this under control, then you have good reason to worry. So that's not true for China, just true for China, by the way. It's true for most countries, but it's particularly true in China.
Right, thank you so much. So we have Yuri Ilyakin, who would like to ask something, and then Dmitry Suslov would follow up, and we will finish after those two, I believe. So Yuri.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you for a very interesting lecture and opinions. My question is very simple. Each conflict here has sides. Now we are talking about the US and China relations. And who is more interested in this conflict? China or United States? And who is most uninterested side in this conflict? I mean, not only these two sides, but the whole world, including Russia. This is my question.
Yeah, it's very hard to tell because it depends on the issues that you're actually looking at. I think what China wants to do is to have a gradual rise in its power without too much conflict with the United States. I mean, let's face it, I don't know in history of another country that has had such a benign rise to power as what China has had over the last generation and a half. Maybe the United States back in the mid-19th century, but after all, they got themselves embroiled in a civil war while all of this was happening. So maybe not. But the international circumstances have been really good from a Chinese perspective. They did misjudge, as I said earlier on, the effects of the unipolar world created in part by China's own actions back in the 1970s and 80s in joining up with the United States in confronting the Soviet Union. But even that turned out for China only to be a temporary setback because it was able to piggyback on American power to grow its own economy, right? Doing exactly what it, for a lot of different reasons, was not possible for Russia to do after 1991. So, China wants this process to continue. China would like, those who talk about Xi Jinping and his group as being sort of inherently aggressive, making a, Kaiser Wilhelm-like grab for world power are almost certainly wrong. That's not what this is about. This would be about China's gradual rise, as long as they can get it. Right? On the American side, of course, this looks very different, as several of you have pointed out already, that business as usual didn't seem to serve U.S. interests well, at least on parts of the picture, right? And that's what creates the turn against China that you see on the U.S. side. Again, on this, a lot of American analysts who are saying, the criticism of the forms of Chinese growth that have now spread in the United States is not concentrated on one political party or one political group. It's remarkably universal. And that, I think, is a reflection of it. So, they have different approaches to it. I mean, I'm as I said now several times, I'm happy with a gradual growth in Chinese power as long as China doesn't overreach during that process and start throwing its weight around, like the Americans did when they grew to power. in its region, which is now increasingly globalized. Back in the 19th century, what you did towards Mexico or what you did towards Canada would not unleash a world crisis, but a conflict between China and Japan, a war in Korea, a conflict in the South China Sea could unleash a global conflict. So that's what I'm preoccupied with, is that, again, the gradual development within which this happens. And then, that doesn't get us out of the woods. So people like us still have to think about, if my sincerest wish is then fulfilled, and we are developing more slowly over a generation towards a multipolar international system, well, what is that international system going to look like, right? And we better start thinking about that now. And Russia has a very important role to play within this. Is it a system where might makes right, where the more powerful countries are able to act, and as Thucydides said, the smaller nations are made to suffer whatever consequences that come out of it? Is it a more integrated international system where international organizations, not necessarily at the UN level, but some form of organization, have more of a role? Do we need to do more to build international law, which is one area where the United States, in the last phase of its hegemony, seemed to me to have failed to a very high extent? Think about the Iraq War, for instance. So these are the challenges that we will be facing, and if we want to see a well-functioning multipolar system, not a dysfunctional multipolar system of the late 19th century kind, we better start thinking about those things now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Dmitry had a few concluding remarks, I believe, and we'll finish after that.
Well, not really concluding remarks, but I wanted just to emphasize our complete agreement with Professor Westad on the danger of rapid destabilization of the international system now and war. Indeed, now when we face coronavirus, we shouldn't be distracted by, we should be distracted from the more fundamental things which are produced by this absolutely rapid and unprecedented change in the distribution of power in the world. Olga talked about the experience of other great powers and their adaptation to the realities of the loss of their empires. I think it will be more difficult for the United States to adapt because unlike previous hegemons, the United States have never ever had an experience of running the world jointly together with other great powers. Now, the United States jumped from isolationism to hegemonism in its foreign policy. It absolutely lacks the experience of joint creation of international order together with other great powers in a multipolar framework, plus the American ideology, which is universalist, plus the end of history was proclaimed just 30-something or 40 years ago, not far away. Right, and they're still living in this paradigm. Thus, I completely agree they will fight for the preservation of this idea of the US-led global order. They're still sure that they can prevail. I don't know whether you paid attention with it, the recent publication by Christopher Ford in the State Department, in which he explained in details the policy of dual confrontation, and it will be very difficult from both sides. I mean, the danger of war, of inadvertent great power war nowadays is very high and continues to rise. This is why it will be important, for instance, to convene the P5 summit this year, and so on and so forth. And final point, I very much agree with you that we should think about the post-American international order, post-hegemonic international order. But in the meantime, I think we will witness a continuation of the fight. We will witness a disorder, the essence of which will be this global competition between the United States and some China-centric, I don't know, coalition or whatever, which will prevent us from thinking about the order beyond.
No, I agree with much of that, Dimitri. I think that's an astute observation. I'd like to add to it, though, that on the Russian side, this is also a moment of great responsibility. I think, you know, the only other country, that great power that I know of historically, that where there are some doubts whether it would qualify as what I call a normal country, would be Russia. Because of Russia's history, because of its background, because of its size. And that is a big question. So you're entirely right in saying that, different from the United States, Russia has the experience historically of working within a multipolar system where it was one of the strongest poles back in the 19th century, right? Since then, Russia has little of that experience. Right? I think this is the moment where Russia, for its own reasons, need to take its international responsibilities beyond its own immediate interests much more seriously, both because it can act as a balancer in a way that would have been unthinkable only 10 years ago. But also, I think, because Russia is really needed in terms of collaboration. And because I know everything about how difficult the relationship between the United States and Russia is at the moment, or indeed between Europe, between the European Union, I should rather say, and Russia is. But limiting Russia's foreign policy to those squabbles, I think, would be a bad mistake. I think in many ways, and this is part of the point that I made in the foreign affairs piece, if there is one power that can have a more direct and positive impact in terms of the development, if we now foresee it correctly, sort of how we move out of our current situation and towards a more balanced and eventually more multipolar international system, it will probably be Russia. So, you know, that's a huge historical challenge. And it will be really interesting to see over the next few years how Russia handles that. Russia is not the only country, but it's the most prominent country that is in that position.
Thank you very much.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. So did Professor Lukin or Professor Karaganov want to say concluding remarks, or should we call it quits?
I think we should just thank our speaker for a great talk.
Yeah.
And
thank you so much. This is a fantastic opportunity for everyone.
Yes, and
I would ask to take a picture, in fact, but the circumstances are slightly odd, so.
We will have a chance to do that later, Olga. Thank you all very much for setting this up.
Thank you. It was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Good to see everyone. Take good care of yourselves.
Cheers.
See you in Moscow soon.
Thank you.